Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now this is the Intel Core i3-14100F. I believe it's the fastest quad-core CPU available at the time of this video, but the question is, should you buy one? The 14100F has 4 cores, 8 threads and 12MB of L3 cache, the same as the 13100F and 12100F before it. This time we have a 3.5 GHz base clock and a max turbo of 4.7. It will work with either DDR4 or DDR5 socket 1700 motherboards, though I've tested it with 16GB of 3200 MHz DDR4 today, as this is the more budget friendly option. In the box we have the processor itself as well as a cooler or thermal solution as stated. Paste is pre-applied to the copper base. This does an adequate job and is pretty much inaudible at low load. Even during CPU intensive situations, the noise from the fan isn't too bad, at least not in my opinion, a huge improvement over the fans of previous generations. If you were to pair one of these with, say, an RTX 4060, a capable 1080p gaming card, then you should be able to run most of the latest and greatest games with respectable graphics settings and frame rates. There will be one or two hiccups in more NPC heavy scenarios or in other scenes whereby the processor is expected to do a lot of the heavy lifting. Let's run through some benchmarks. In Battlefield 5 at 1080p with the high preset we saw 177 FPS with a 1% low of 119 and a 0.1% low of 71. I've kept the boxed cooler atop the processor for the following benchmarks. Also note the power consumption during today's benchmarks. Baldur's Gate 3 up next, 1080p with the high preset here for 97 FPS. I was expecting a few more dips and drops in and around this busy city area, but we still saw a 1% low of 55 and a 0.1% low of 33, so our system held up pretty well. In all honesty, the i3 may even hold the 4060 back in some scenarios, so you could definitely pair this with a cheaper GPU. I think something like the RX 6600 would be a good choice, as that seems to be falling in price and is still pretty decent when it comes to 1920 by 1080 gaming. Forza Horizon 5 next, 1080p, ultra preset, 126 FPS here, no issues for our setup today. 106 was the 1% low and the 0.1% low was recorded as 95. Grand Theft Auto 5 is older, but at the highest settings it can still push certain hardware to its limits. Here I also enabled FXAA and turned all the advanced options up to their maximum for an average of 105. Our 1% low was 75 and our 0.1% low was 66. A very consistent experience from our 4-core CPU. Cyberpunk 2077 up next. The high preset was selected, but I chose medium crowds, or the game did by default I should say, and this probably helps out a little bit considering that we have just 4 cores to work with. 92 was the average here with a 1% low of 61 and a 0.1% low of 34. Red Dead Redemption 2 up next. High settings here with the ultra textures and TAA set to high. The average was 93, the 1% low was 69, nice, and the 0.1% low was 64. Where you're going to see most of the little dips and drops is in and around cities and towns like Valentine and Saint Denis. Fortnite now with the medium preset for 187 FPS. It's clear that there were some issues here. I do experience the occasional dip and drop in Fortnite on various hardware, but here it was a little more prominent and perhaps the game didn't quite agree with our lower core and thread count, but it was still definitely playable as far as I'm concerned. CS2 to finalise for these benchmarks with the low settings here, or the low preset. 230 was the average with a 1% low of 111 and a 0.1% low of 91. So this CPU is definitely enough for us to remain competitive here, though hopefully you're a better player than I am. It's clear that quad cores aren't dead in 2024, but the question you may be asking now is, does the i3 14100F make sense over the older 12100F, a chip that's almost identical in specs apart from the slightly reduced frequencies and of course the lower price tag. After all, the 12100F is currently around £30 cheaper here in the UK. To find out, I've upped the graphics card to a 4070 Super, which should prevent any GPU limited situations and allow us to see more of a difference between these two chips. If we start off with some CPU intensive benchmarks, Cinebench R23 and DaVinci Resolve, we can see that the 14100F does, as expected, pull ahead ever so slightly here, and it's certainly the better choice for rendering, though I'd certainly opt for something with more cores if that was your intention. When it comes to the gaming results, we'll start with The Witcher 3 Next Gen with the Ultra settings. The i3-12100F hit 114 FPS on average with a 1% low of 72 and a 0.1% low of 49. The 14100F hit a few frames more on average, 119, and it was a little more consistent overall. In fact, that 0.1% low of 59 was a very welcome improvement over the 12100F's 49, but that's not to say the 12100F offered a bad experience. Forza Horizon 5 at the Ultra preset here, the 14100F pretty much performed exactly the same in terms of an average, and the 1% lows were very similar as well. Nothing much to report here. Kingdom Come Deliverance is quite problematic on lower core count CPUs, and despite having 4 cores and 8 threads with both, the 14100F pulled ahead ever so slightly with a few more frames on average. The 1% low was also improved, and we saw a nice boost to that 0.1% figure as well. It didn't really feel any smoother though, so that's worth bearing in mind. We could definitely do with more cores here. Starfield, this can be pretty troublesome for certain processors. We saw a few frames on average more once again with the newer 14100F, and the 1 and 0.1% lows were ever so slightly improved. In fact, that 0.1% low was up from 26 to 31 with the newer 14th gen chip. Cyberpunk Ultra preset here. Now this was interesting, we saw 6 more frames per second on average running the in-game benchmark. You might be wondering why the averages are so high, and this is because the in-game benchmark takes place indoors to start with, so our average figures are a lot higher. When we get outside of the building, this is where things start to drop, and this is reflected in those percentile lows. Once again, the 14100F did ever so slightly better. £30 better, I'm not so sure, but that's up to you to decide. Red Dead Redemption 2 to finalise for our comparisons here, 112 FPS for the 12th gen part and 114 for the 14th gen part. The 1% low was also improved, and this time our 0.1% figure was actually a little worse with the newer chip. Overall, the 14100F is impressive, but it's not really that much more impressive than the 12100F, which continues to do pretty good in 2024. You might be wondering how the 13100F does as well, because that of course exists, but here in the UK it seems to be a lot more scarce and or more expensive than the 14th gen chip, ruling it out as an option in my opinion. That will probably be even closer in performance to the 14100F though, just in case you can find one for cheap. If you want to build an Intel-based PC on a lower budget that can play all your favourite games, just get the 12100F and be sure to consider the i5 12400F too, if budget allows, because the extra cores and threads will really help out these days. In other words, if you're thinking of a 14100F over the 12100F, forget about that and just go for the i5 instead, because I have seen it at pretty much the same price on some stores. Overall, thanks for watching. I hope this has been helpful, and let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'll see you in the next one.